Could the humble yam and coffee bean be the secret weapons that finally shift the balance of power in the Caribbean? Jamaica is quietly cultivating an agricultural revolution that few are talking about, one that could redefine regional dominance. Is Trinidad's long-standing economic lead about to face its biggest challenge yet from an unexpected rival? Before we dive into this incredible story, if you want to stay updated on the economic shifts reshaping the Caribbean and the world, hit that subscribe button. We're on a mission to reach 10,000 subscribers, and your support means everything. Now, let's uncover what's really happening in the Caribbean's green revolution. Picture this: 2 islands, 2 destinies, 1 region holding its breath. For decades, the Caribbean has watched as Trinidad and Tobago stood tall as the economic titan of the Eastern Caribbean, their coffers overflowing with petrodollars, their influence undeniable, their position seemingly unshakable. Meanwhile, Jamaica, known for its reggae rhythms, sprinting legends, and sun-drenched beaches, played a different game entirely. One focused on tourism and cultural exports while its agricultural potential lay largely dormant, waiting for someone to wake it up. But something extraordinary is happening right now, something that could rewrite the economic map of the entire region. The sleeping giant is stirring, and it's carrying a machete in one hand and cutting-edge technology in the other. This isn't just another story about farming. This is about power, transformation, and the audacious possibility that a nation long overlooked in the economic arena might just be positioning itself to leap ahead of its wealthier neighbor. The question isn't whether change is coming. The question is whether Trinidad is ready for what Jamaica is about to unleash. Let's rewind and understand how we got here. Trinidad and Tobago discovered massive oil and natural gas reserves in the early 20th century, and those black gold deposits transformed the twin island nation into the Caribbean's undisputed economic heavyweight. While other Caribbean nations struggled with post-colonial economic transitions, Trinidad built refineries, attracted international energy corporations, and constructed an economy that didn't just survive but thrived. The energy sector became the golden goose, accounting for roughly 40% of the nation's GDP and nearly 80% of exports at various points. The government had money for infrastructure, education, healthcare. Trinidad wasn't just rich by Caribbean standards. It was operating in a different economic stratosphere altogether. Jamaica, by contrast, took a different path after independence. The nation invested heavily in bauxite mining and tourism, creating an economy that brought in visitors by the millions and exported the raw materials for aluminum production worldwide. Agriculture, once the backbone of the Jamaican economy during the sugar plantation era, gradually faded into the background. Why toil in the fields when tourists were arriving by the plane load and bauxite was fetching good prices on international markets? For decades, this seemed like a reasonable strategy. Tourism created jobs, brought in foreign currency, and put Jamaica on the global map as a premier destination. But there was a problem lurking beneath the surface, one that would become painfully obvious during global crises. Jamaica was importing nearly 90% of its food. Think about that for a moment. An island nation blessed with fertile volcanic soil, abundant rainfall, and year-round growing seasons was shipping in the vast majority of what its people ate for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Then came the wake-up calls. Global food price spikes, supply chain disruptions, the pandemic revealing just how vulnerable import-dependent economies really were. And something clicked in the minds of Jamaican policymakers, entrepreneurs, and farmers. What if the very thing they'd been overlooking, the soil beneath their feet, could be the key to not just food security but economic transformation? What if agriculture wasn't a relic of the past but the weapon of the future? The transformation began quietly, almost imperceptibly at first. The Jamaican government started pumping resources into agricultural modernization with a focus that hadn't been seen in generations. But this wasn't your grandfather's farming. This was agriculture reimagined for the 21st century, combining traditional knowledge with cutting-edge technology in ways that would make Silicon Valley take notice. Hydroponics facilities began sprouting up across the island, allowing farmers to grow vegetables using a fraction of the water traditional farming required, a crucial advantage in a region increasingly concerned about climate change and water scarcity. Precision farming techniques, once the exclusive domain of massive industrial operations in North America and Europe, started appearing on small Jamaican farms, with drones monitoring crop health and soil sensors, providing real-time data to farmers who just a few years earlier were relying entirely on generational knowledge and instinct. But here's where the story gets really interesting. Jamaica didn't just modernize existing crops. They diversified in ways that positioned them at the forefront of emerging markets. Medical cannabis became a game changer when Jamaica amended its Dangerous Drugs Act and created a legal framework for the cultivation and processing of cannabis for medical, therapeutic, and scientific purposes. They weren't just catching a trend. They were positioning themselves as potential leaders in a global industry, projected to be worth hundreds of billions of dollars. Jamaica's international reputation and ideal growing conditions gave them a brand advantage that few other nations could match. Suddenly, investors who'd never considered Jamaican agriculture were paying attention. Exotic fruits became another frontier. Dragon fruit, passion fruit, soursop, and other tropical varieties that commanded premium prices in international markets found new life in Jamaican farms equipped with modern post-harvest handling and cold chain logistics. But the real masterstroke was value-added processing. Instead of simply exporting raw coffee beans, Jamaican producers began creating premium roasted and packaged products that captured far more of the final retail price. Instead of shipping fresh fruit that would perish quickly, they invested in processing facilities creating juices, purees, and frozen products with longer shelf lives and higher margins. The economic logic was brilliant. Why compete on volume when you can compete on value? The government didn't stop at technology and infrastructure. They launched comprehensive farmer training programs, bringing agricultural extension services into the modern era with workshops on everything from organic certification to digital marketing. Young Jamaicans who might have seen farming as their grandparents' occupation suddenly saw it as a viable, even attractive career path. Agricultural cooperatives gained new strength, allowing small farmers to pool resources, share equipment, and negotiate better prices collectively. The entire ecosystem was being rewired from the ground up, and the results started showing up in the numbers. Agricultural export earnings began climbing. Food import bills started shrinking. Rural unemployment, long a stubborn problem in Jamaica's interior parishes, showed signs of declining as agricultural opportunities pulled people back to the land. But this time armed with smartphones, modern equipment, and business training their predecessors never had access to. The Jamaican dollar strengthened slightly against persistent depreciation trends. None of these changes happened overnight, but together they represented something undeniable. Momentum. The kind of momentum that, once established, becomes very difficult to stop. Now let's turn our attention to Trinidad, because understanding this story requires understanding both sides of the equation. Trinidad's energy wealth, for all its benefits, created what economists call the resource curse, though Trinidadians might bristle at that term. When one sector dominates an economy so completely, it distorts everything else. Why invest in agriculture when oil revenues can simply import whatever food is needed? Why develop manufacturing when energy exports bring in more foreign currency than factories ever could? For decades, this logic seemed sound. Trinidad's agricultural sector withered not from neglect in the traditional sense, but from rational economic calculation. Energy paid better. Energy was easier. Energy was the obvious choice. But obvious choices have a way of becoming obvious problems when circumstances change. global energy markets became increasingly volatile. The rise of renewable energy, while still decades away from displacing fossil fuels entirely, began shifting long-term investment patterns. International oil companies started viewing Caribbean operations differently as massive deposits in other regions offered better returns. Trinidad's oil production peaked and began a slow decline, and while natural gas offered some buffer, the writing was on the wall. The golden goose wasn't dead, but it was aging, and no one had prepared a successor. Trinidad made some efforts to diversify. There were initiatives to boost agriculture, government programs offering incentives, task forces producing reports with recommendations. But here's the brutal truth. When you have decades of structural economic orientation toward one sector, reversing course requires more than initiatives and incentives. It requires a complete reimagining of national economic strategy. And that kind of transformation is extraordinarily difficult, especially when the old model is still generating revenue, just less of it than before. Trinidad's agricultural output remained relatively stagnant. The nation continued importing the vast majority of its food. Farming remained something that happened on the periphery of the economy rather than at its center. And while Trinidadian policymakers talked about diversification, Jamaica was actually doing it. The contrast became stark. Jamaica, with fewer natural resources and a smaller economy, was outmaneuvering Trinidad in agricultural innovation and productivity growth. The David and Goliath dynamic wasn't just metaphorical anymore. It was showing up in trade statistics, investment flows, and regional influence. Let's talk about what this means beyond just two nations and their agricultural outputs, because the implications ripple far beyond Kingston and Port of Spain. The Caribbean community, CARICOM, has long struggled with food security. The region imports approximately $4 billion worth of food annually, a staggering figure for a population of roughly 15 million people. Much of what's consumed could theoretically be grown locally, but fragmented production, inadequate distribution networks, and the ease of importing from massive agricultural exporters like the United States made local production economically challenging. Jamaica's agricultural resurgence changes this calculation fundamentally. If Jamaica can produce high-quality vegetables, fruits, processed foods, and specialty crops at competitive prices with reliable supply chains, other CARICOM nations become natural markets. Trinidad, despite its wealth, still needs to feed its population. Barbados, with limited agricultural land, imports heavily. The Eastern Caribbean island nations have similar constraints. Jamaica isn't just growing food for Jamaicans anymore. They're positioning themselves as the potential breadbasket of the Caribbean, a role no nation has successfully claimed in the modern era. The country that controls regional food supply doesn't just make money. It gains influence, leverage, and strategic importance that transcends agriculture itself. The job creation aspect cannot be overstated. Trinidad's energy sector, for all the revenue it generates, employs a relatively small percentage of the population. It's capital-intensive, not labor-intensive. Agriculture, especially the diversified, value-added model Jamaica is pursuing, creates employment across the spectrum. Farm workers, yes, but also processing facility employees, logistics coordinators, quality control specialists, agricultural technicians, marketing professionals, and export managers. These aren't just jobs. They're careers with advancement potential, and they're concentrated in rural areas where economic opportunities have historically been scarce. Jamaica is essentially building economic resilience from the ground up, creating a more distributed prosperity that doesn't rely on a single commodity or sector. For Trinidad, the implications are uncomfortable. Imagine being the wealthy neighbor for decades, the one everyone looked to for economic leadership, only to watch the island you'd subtly dismissed as the poor cousin suddenly innovating, growing, and potentially overtaking you in a sector you'd ignored. It's not just about economics. It's about prestige, influence, and regional leadership. If Jamaica's agricultural revolution continues its trajectory, while Trinidad's economy remains tethered to declining energy production, the power dynamics of the Eastern Caribbean will fundamentally shift. We're not talking about a sudden collapse or overnight reversal, but a gradual, inexorable change in who sets the agenda, who other nations emulate, and who drives regional policy. There's also the broader geopolitical dimension. Food security is increasingly recognized as a national security issue. Nations that control their food supply are less vulnerable to external shocks, trade disputes, and supply chain disruptions. As climate change intensifies, as geopolitical tensions create new barriers to global trade, the countries that have invested in agricultural resilience will be positioned far better than those that remain dependent on imports. Jamaica is making that investment now. Trinidad, despite its wealth, is not, at least not at the same scale or with the same urgency. Now let's look forward, because the really fascinating question isn't where things stand today, but where they're heading 5, 10, 20 years from now. Can Jamaica sustain this agricultural revolution? Or will it prove to be a temporary surge that fizzles out like so many development initiatives before it? The honest answer is that sustainability depends on several critical factors, and not all of them are firmly in place yet. First, there's the question of climate resilience. The Caribbean faces increasing hurricane intensity, changing rainfall patterns, and rising temperatures. Agriculture, even modern agriculture, remains vulnerable to weather extremes. Jamaica's investment in hydroponics and controlled environment agriculture provides some buffer, but the nation will need continued innovation in drought-resistant crop varieties, improved water management systems, and disaster recovery protocols that can get farmers back in production quickly after storms. This isn't insurmountable, but it requires sustained focus and investment. Second, there's market access. Jamaica has made impressive strides, but competing in global agricultural markets means going up against subsidized producers in wealthy nations, massive industrial farms with economies of scale, and established supply chains that are difficult to penetrate. Jamaica's brand advantage, particularly with products like Blue Mountain coffee and now medical cannabis, helps enormously, but maintaining quality standards, meeting international certification requirements, and building reliable export relationships requires institutional capacity that takes years to develop fully. The infrastructure is being built, but it's still a work in progress. Third, there's the generational question. Will young Jamaicans continue seeing agriculture as a viable career, or will the traditional pull of urban jobs, emigration to North America and the United Kingdom, and the allure of other sectors draw talent away? So far, the modernization of agriculture has helped make farming attractive to a younger generation, but maintaining that appeal requires continued innovation, decent incomes, and a quality of life that competes with alternatives. Rural infrastructure, internet connectivity, healthcare access, and educational opportunities all play into whether the agricultural transformation can retain the human capital it needs. Fourth, there's policy continuity. Agricultural transformation doesn't happen in election cycles. It requires sustained commitment across multiple governments, consistent funding even when budgets are tight, and resistance to the temptation to chase the next shiny economic development strategy when agriculture isn't producing dramatic year-over-year gains. Jamaica's political system, like most democracies, faces pressures that can derail long-term projects. The true test will be whether the agricultural focus survives leadership changes and economic pressures. If Jamaica navigates these challenges successfully, and there are good reasons to believe they can, the implications for regional dominance are profound. Trinidad would find itself in an uncomfortable position, watching its historical economic advantage erode while lacking the agricultural base to compete in this new paradigm. The response options for Trinidad are limited, and all require significant political will. They could launch a crash program to develop their own agricultural sector, but that means overcoming decades of structural neglect and competing with Jamaica's head start. They could lean even harder into energy, hoping that natural gas extends their advantage long enough to transition later. But that's increasingly a bet against global energy transition trends. Or they could accept a new reality where economic leadership is more distributed across the Caribbean, with different nations excelling in different sectors. For a country accustomed to dominance, that third option might be the hardest pill to swallow. For other Caribbean nations, Jamaica's trajectory offers both inspiration and pressure. If Jamaica can transform its agricultural sector, why can't Barbados, St. Lucia, or Grenada? The answer, of course, is that they can, and some are already trying. But Jamaica's scale, its ability to achieve economies of scope across multiple crops and products, and its established international brand give it advantages smaller nations cannot easily replicate. What emerges might not be Jamaican dominance replacing Trinidadian dominance, but rather a more competitive, dynamic regional economy, where nations specialize in what they do best and trade more effectively with each other. That would actually be a healthier outcome for the Caribbean as a whole, reducing vulnerability and increasing collective resilience. There's also the question of collaboration versus competition. CARICOM was founded on principles of regional integration and cooperation, yet member states often compete for the same tourists, the same foreign investment, and the same export markets. Agriculture could go either way. Jamaica could view its agricultural development as a competitive advantage to guard jealously, keeping innovations proprietary and viewing other islands' success as threats to its market share. Or the region could embrace a collaborative approach, sharing technology, coordinating production to avoid market gluts, and presenting a united front to external markets. The difference between these approaches could determine whether the Caribbean as a whole benefits from Jamaica's agricultural revolution, or whether it simply reshuffles regional hierarchies without lifting all boats. Here's what makes this moment so crucial. We're watching a potential inflection point, one of those rare historical moments when the trajectory of nations and regions can shift fundamentally. These moments don't announce themselves with fanfare. They emerge gradually from thousands of decisions, investments, and innovations that accumulate until suddenly the landscape looks completely different. Trinidad's energy dominance seemed permanent until it didn't. Jamaica's agricultural stagnation seemed intractable until it wasn't. The lesson isn't that specific outcomes are inevitable, but that adaptability, vision, and willingness to reimagine national economic strategy can overcome even significant structural disadvantages. For viewers around the world, regardless of whether you've ever set foot in the Caribbean, this story matters because it's fundamentally about something universal. It's about how nations respond to changing circumstances. It's about whether resource wealth becomes a blessing or a curse. It's about the power of innovation to disrupt established hierarchies. It's about food security in an age of climate change and geopolitical instability. And it's about the simple, profound truth that no advantage lasts forever and no disadvantage is permanent. The humble yam and coffee bean, the machete and the hydroponic system, the small farmer with a smartphone, and the processing facility with export certifications. These are the weapons in Jamaica's agricultural revolution, and they're proving more potent than anyone expected. Trinidad's economic dominance, built on energy wealth, faces a challenge it never anticipated from a direction it wasn't watching. Whether this challenge culminates in Jamaica genuinely overtaking Trinidad depends on execution, sustainability, and a dozen variables that will play out over years and decades. But here's what we know right now. The balance is shifting. The old assumptions no longer hold, and the Caribbean's economic future is being written in Jamaican soil, one carefully tended crop at a time. The question isn't whether change is coming. The question is who's ready for it. Jamaica seems to be. Trinidad needs to decide if it is. And the rest of the Caribbean is watching closely, wondering if they should be planting seeds of their own. The agricultural revolution is here. The only question left is who will harvest its rewards.